The letter arrived on a Tuesday in April of 1862, and by Wednesday morning Perry Sullivan was gone, leaving behind 30 acres of dry Texas soil, a half-broken mare named Duchess, and a woman named Inez Grady who had loved him quietly for 3 years without ever saying so out loud. Inez stood at the edge of the porch and watched the dust cloud that followed his wagon until it disappeared over the ridge south of Harlan Creek, and then she stood there a little longer, because the silence that came after felt heavier than anything she had ever carried. The Confederate Army had called for volunteers from every able-bodied man in Caldwell County, and Perry Sullivan, being the kind of man who believed in standing for something even when it cost him everything, had signed his name without hesitation. He had told her the night before he left, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold between his hands, that he needed someone to watch the land. He had not said it the way a man says something simple. He had looked at her with those steady brown eyes of his and said, "Inez, I need to know this place will still be here when I come back. I wouldn't trust it to anyone else." She had said she would handle it. She had said it plainly, the way she said most things, and he had nodded like that settled the matter entirely. What she had not said was that the thought of him leaving made the air feel thin, or that she had spent half that night sitting on the back step listening to the coyotes call across the flat and trying to figure out when exactly a man's presence had become as necessary to her as water. Perry Sullivan was 26 years old when he rode away to war. Inez Grady was 24. They were not married. They were not even courting, not officially, not in any way that the people of Harlan Creek would have called proper. Perry owned the land. Inez had come to help with the household after his mother passed 2 winters prior, and she had stayed because there was work, and because she was practical above all things, and because somewhere in the practical arrangement of her days, she had grown to love the man who worked from sunup to past dark and always left a lamp burning in the window. The land Perry Sullivan owned sat 7 miles east of the town of Lockhart, Texas, which in 1862 was a small but functioning community of ranchers, farmers, a dry goods store, a livery, a church, and a saloon that conducted more actual business than the church on most days. The 30 acres were not rich land. There was a creek that ran along the north edge of the property, reliable enough in good years, and the soil grew cotton tolerably well in the eastern fields, while the western acres held a small cattle operation, 7 head of longhorn that Perry had built up over 4 years of careful work. The house was modest, 2 rooms with a sleeping loft, built from cedar and determination, and the barn was in better shape than the house because Perry always said that the animals that kept you alive deserved the better roof. Inez knew all of this. She had watched it all being built, had helped where she could, had learned the rhythms of the land the way you learn the habits of someone you care about, noting what it needed before it told you. She had grown up outside of Gonzales, the second daughter of a farming family, and she knew hard work the way some people know their own name without having to think about it. But knowing hard work and being alone with 30 acres and a half-broken mare and no money to speak of were 3 different things, and the morning after Perry left, Inez stood in the kitchen and did an accounting of what she had. She had 7 longhorn cattle, 4 of them cows, 1 a young bull, 2 steers. She had a kitchen garden that was just going in. She had 12 rows of cotton seed waiting to be planted in the east field. She had the mare Duchess, who was green and unpredictable but young and strong. She had Perry's older working horse, a bay gelding he called Samson, who knew the land like a map and would do the work without complaint. She had enough flour and salt pork to last 2 months if she was careful. She had a rifle and knew how to use it. She had $40 in coin that Perry had left in a coffee tin on the shelf above the stove, pressed into her hands with an apology in his eyes that she had told him to put away. She also had a note, written in Perry's careful hand, that said, "Inez, the bank note on the property comes due in October. $40 should hold until the cotton comes in. Duchess needs another 30 days of easy work before she's fit for field use. The north fence near the creek needs mending before summer, or you'll lose the cattle to the Wilson spread. The Sullivan land has been in my family since my father broke this ground in 1847. I am trusting it to the best person I know. P.S. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in the pocket of her work apron and went outside to start the day. The first month was the hardest, not because the work was impossible, but because it was relentless and there was no one to share it with. She planted the cotton herself, walking the rows with the seed planter from before sunup to past midday, then spent the afternoons managing the cattle and the evenings mending fence or tending to the garden, or simply trying to keep the mare from tearing down the paddock rail out of boredom. She ate alone. She slept in the small room off the kitchen that had been hers since she came to work for the Sullivans, and she lay awake some nights listening to the wind come through the flat and thinking about where Perry might be, whether he was sleeping on cold ground or warm, whether he was safe. The town of Lockhart was not unfriendly to her, but it was not without its complications. Most of the women whose husbands had gone to fight were managing in similar circumstances, pulling together where they could, sharing what they had in the way that hard times force people to do. But Inez's position was particular. She was not Perry's wife. She was not his kin. She was an unmarried woman alone on a man's land, and there were people in Harlan Creek who thought that arrangement was something to gossip about and perhaps to take advantage of. The trouble came from a man named Denton Hale. Denton Hale was 43 years old, wide through the shoulders, with a gray-streaked beard and small, pale eyes that had a way of moving across everything they looked at as though calculating its worth. He owned the largest operation in the county, a sprawling cattle ranch to the south of Perry's land, and he had wanted Perry's acres for years. The creek along the north boundary was the reason. Water rights in central Texas in the 1860s were worth more than gold in dry years, and Denton Hale had spent a decade watching Perry Sullivan's modest spread control access to Harlan Creek, while his own cattle had to be driven 2 miles further to water. He came to the property in early May, riding a fine sorrel horse, with 2 of his ranch hands trailing behind him at a respectful distance that was still close enough to make a point. Inez was at the fence line near the gate when he arrived. She had a hammer in her hand and a bucket of nails at her feet, and she did not put the hammer down when he pulled up. "Miss Grady," he said, pulling his hat up slightly in what passed for a greeting. "Understand Sullivan's gone to the war." "He is," she said. "That's a hard thing, a woman alone managing all this," he said, and he made a broad gesture with his hand that took in the fields and the house and everything between. There was nothing kind in the gesture. It was the way a man measures something he is thinking about buying. "I'm managing fine," she said. "I'd like to make an offer on the property," he said. "Fair market price, maybe a little above on account of the circumstances." "The property is not for sale," she said. "Perry Sullivan might think differently when he gets back and finds the bank's taken it," Hale said. His voice was smooth and pleasant and had nothing pleasant behind it. October's not far off, and cotton prices are what they are with the blockade cutting off the northern buyers. Inez looked at him steadily. "The property is not for sale," she said again. He left without pressing further, but she understood that he would be back. Men like Denton Hale did not make one offer and move on. They circled and waited and came back when the circumstances had gotten a little worse. She thought about it that evening, sitting on the porch with Sampson tied nearby, and the sun going orange and flat over the western fields. The blockade was a real concern. The Confederate government had been strangling cotton exports, and the northern buyers who had kept Texas cotton prices stable were not accessible. She needed to think differently about how to make the land pay. The solution came from an unexpected direction. Her neighbor to the east, a woman named Hattie Beaumont, whose husband Clarence had also gone to fight, stopped by the following week in a wagon loaded with jars. Hattie was a practical woman in her mid-30s with arms like a blacksmith and a laugh that could startle horses. and she and Inez had the kind of friendship that functions on shared trouble. "I'm selling preserves and dried goods in Lockhart," Hattie told her, climbing down from the wagon and eyeing Inez's garden with appreciation. "The mercantile is paying fair prices because the regular supply lines are disrupted. Your garden is bigger than mine. If you can grow it, I can sell it, and we split what we get." It was not a fortune, but it was a start. Inez expanded the kitchen garden, planting every inch of ground she had not already committed to cotton, and through the summer she grew tomatoes and sweet corn and squash and dried beans in quantities that surprised even herself. Hattie came twice a month with the wagon and they loaded it together, and Hattie drove it into town and came back with money and sometimes news. The news from the war was slow and often bad. In the summer of 1862, the fighting in Virginia and Tennessee and along the Mississippi was ferocious, and the names of battles drifted back to Lockhart the way bad weather drifts in from the horizon, looking small at first and then becoming everything. Inez tracked what she could from the newspapers that circulated through Hattie's hands, but Perry's unit was somewhere in the Eastern Theater, and the information was fragments at best. She wrote to him careful letters full of the practical details of the land and the work, because she knew that was what he would want to know, and she tucked one or two personal sentences at the end of each letter, almost like they had been added by accident. Things like, "The mare has settled some and she doesn't fight the saddle as hard as she used to, which reminds me of someone I know who also came around eventually." Or, "The evenings are the longest part. The land knows you're gone even if it won't say so." She did not know if the letters reached him. There was no reliable postal system through the Confederate Army for a man of Perry's rank and situation. But she wrote them and she sent them, and she kept a copy of each one in the cedar box under her bed because writing them helped her think more clearly. The cotton came in at the end of August, and it was a good crop, better than she had dared to hope. The rains had come right in June and tapered off in July, which was exactly what Cotton wanted, and the 30 rows she had planted had filled out thick and white. The problem was getting it to market. The gin in Lockhart was backed up with every farm in the county trying to process their cotton before fall, and prices were depressed because the Confederate government was paying in scrip that was worth less every month. Inez was not going to accept scrip. She drove the cotton into Lockhart herself with Sampson pulling the wagon, Duchess tied to the back, because she was slowly getting reliable enough to lead if not yet to drive, and she went straight to the mercantile, and then to the feed store, and then to a man named August Voss, a German immigrant who had settled 3 miles north of Lockhart in 1855, and who had the most successful truck farm in the county. August Voss paid in coin. He was not paying for cotton, but he was willing to buy dried beans and corn in bulk for the Mexican laborers who worked his land, and he and Inez struck a deal that afternoon sitting in his yard under a pecan tree that was the size of a small house. She came home with $42 in silver coin, a bushel of pecans that August Voss pressed on her with Germanic insistence, and a contract for the following spring that promised another $30 for the same quantity of grain crops. She stayed up late that night by the lamp, doing the arithmetic on the kitchen table. The banknote was due in October. She had $42 plus the $40 Perry had left, $82. The banknote was $65. She would make it. She lay down that night with something that was not quite peace but was the frontier cousin of it, the satisfaction of a problem that has been outworked rather than solved. In September, she had trouble with the cattle. 2 of her cows had wandered through a gap in the north fence, the same stretch she had mended in May, but which had pulled loose again after the summer storms. They had crossed onto the Wilson spread, a modest operation owned by the widow Clara Wilson, who was as stern as the land and twice as patient. Clara Wilson did not keep them. She sent a boy of about 14, named Tamaz, to Inez's gate with the 2 cows on a rope and a note that said, in a handwriting that looked like a schoolmarm's, "Your fence needs more than nails. Come for supper Friday and bring whatever you have to trade, and we will work something out." Clara Wilson turned out to be one of the best things that happened to Inez Grady that year. She was a widow of 50, Mexican-born, who had married an Anglo rancher named Thomas Wilson in the 50s and inherited the land when he died of fever in 1858. She had 3 sons, 2 of whom were old enough to be off fighting, and one, Tomás, who was 15 and small for his age, and absolutely worth 3 men in terms of actual work. Clara Wilson had a way of seeing situations clearly that reminded Inez of a hawk. No sentiment in the assessment, but no cruelty either, just a clean understanding of what was true. Over supper that first Friday, which was beans and salt beef and cornbread that tasted like Clara Wilson had put love into the recipe whether she intended to or not, Clara looked at Inez and said, "You are going to lose those cattle to hail before winter if that fence is not properly rebuilt. He has been grazing his stock close to your north boundary all summer, testing it." Inez knew this. She had seen the signs but had not had the hands to do the work. "Tomás can help you rebuild it," Clara said. "He is good with post and rail and better with wire. In exchange, I want first access to your creek water through the dry months, not the rights, just the access." "Done," Inez said. Tomás came on Monday with tools and a mule, and an almost frightening level of competence for a 15-year-old. And together, he and Inez spent 4 days rebuilding the north fence from the creek, crossing to the eastern property line. They used proper cedar posts sunk 2 feet deep and 3 strands of wire above a bottom rail, the kind of fence that told Denton Hale's cattle and Denton Hale himself that the Sullivan land knew its own boundaries. Hale rode out to watch them work one afternoon, sitting his horse on his side of the property line and not saying anything. Tomás did not look up from where he was stretching wire. Inez looked up, held the man's pale gaze for a moment, and then went back to work. It was, she thought afterward, the most satisfying conversation she had ever had. October came. She paid the bank note on a crisp Thursday morning, sliding the silver coin across the desk of a bank officer named Edgar Pratt, who looked mildly surprised and slightly disappointed. She kept $15 in reserve and came home and sat on the porch in the autumn light and felt the land beneath her differently than she had before. It was not hers. It was Perry's, would always be Perry's, but she had kept it. She had held it against everything that had tried to take it, and that felt like something permanent, something that would not wash away even after whatever came next. She thought about Perry that evening with a directness she usually did not allow herself. She thought about his voice, which was measured and warm and had a way of arriving at important things sideways, as if he didn't want to alarm you with the significance of what he was saying. She thought about his hands, which were a working man's hands, scarred at the knuckles and always faintly stained with soil, and which she had watched for 3 years with a kind of attention she had not admitted to herself was anything more than idle observation. She thought about the night before he left, how he had stood on the porch and looked out at the dark land, and she had stood beside him, and neither of them had said the things that needed saying, and she had thought then that there would be time. There would always be more time, and then the morning came and he was gone. She wrote him a letter that night that was different from the others. She told him about the bank note. She told him about Hattie and August Voss and Clara Wilson and young Tomás. She told him about the north fence and Denton Hale and the cotton. She told him the mare had finally stopped fighting the saddle entirely and was turning into something worth riding. And then in the last paragraph she wrote, "I have been thinking about what I would say to you if I could say it properly, without the weeks of distance between us. I have thought about it often enough that I feel I ought to say it, even in a letter, even not knowing if this reaches you. I think I have loved this land because I have loved you, and I did not know the difference until you left and the land stayed. Come home, Perry. Come home and I will say the rest of it to your face, which is where it belongs." She sealed it and sent it with the next mail. And then she went back to work because work was the only conversation the land understood, and she intended to keep talking. The winter of 1862 into 1863 was cold but manageable. Inez kept the cattle healthy, lost one steer to a snake bite in November that she found too late, and put up enough wood to keep the house warm through the hard months. She sewed in the evenings, mended harness and clothing, and occasionally rode Duchess out to the east fields just to feel the horse move under her and to see the land from a different angle. Duchess had become, over the months, something of a companion in the way that a difficult creature becomes dear to you precisely because of what it cost to earn its trust. The news from the war grew worse through that winter. Vicksburg was falling. The Mississippi was closing. The Confederacy was bleeding from 100 different wounds. Inez tracked what she could and tried not to measure Perry's survival against the statistics of the battles. She had a practical mind, and she knew that a practical mind was the worst possible instrument for the work of hoping, but it was the only instrument she had. In January of 1863, Hattie Beaumont received a letter that her husband Clarence had been wounded at Stones River in Tennessee. The letter said he was alive and in a hospital somewhere in Georgia, and Hattie sat in Inez's kitchen and cried in the way that practical women cry, which is silently and briefly and with great dignity, and then she wiped her eyes and asked if there was any coffee left. There was coffee left. Inez made it and they sat together and talked about nothing important for an hour, which was exactly the right thing to do. Spring came again with the particular cruelty of beauty, the fields going green and the pecan trees coming out in their new leaves, and everything looking like it was announcing that the world was fine when the world was very much not fine. Inez planted the cotton again and the grain crops for August Voss and expanded the garden further. She had learned in the first year what worked and what didn't, and the second year's planting was more strategic, more confident, planted by someone who now understood the soil's moods and the creek's rhythms, and the way the afternoon wind came from the southwest, and which direction to orient the rows to take advantage of it. Tamaz Wilson came back in the spring and helped her with the heavier field work in exchange for the creek access arrangement, and he brought with him a level of cheerful industry that made long days shorter. He was 16 now, brown and strong and possessed of the kind of uncomplicated competence that Inez found deeply restful. They did not talk much, but they worked well together, and at noon they sat in the shade of the barn and ate whatever Inez had packed, and he told her about his brothers and she told him about the progress of the crops, and it was a good arrangement. She also hired a man that spring, which she had not been able to do the year before. His name was Ezra Cobb. He was 48 years old, a free black man who had been working through the county since before the war doing whatever work needed doing. He was a skilled farmhand, knowledgeable about cattle and fencing and irrigation, and he asked fair wages that Inez could now afford. The hiring of Ezra Cobb was not without its social friction. This was Texas in 1863, and the war was being fought, ostensibly, over questions that included the status of men like Ezra Cobb. Inez was aware of the injustice of the system that surrounded them with a clarity that she could not always speak aloud without consequence. What she could do was pay Ezra Cobb exactly what she would have paid any white farmhand, which she did, and treat him with the same straightforward respect she extended to everyone who worked honestly, which she also did. Ezra Cobb, for his part, was efficient and undemonstrative, and had a way with the Longhorns that was almost miraculous. Under his management, the cattle operation improved measurably over the course of that spring and summer. Denton Hale did not come back with a purchase offer that spring. He came instead with something more troublesome, a rumor, circulated through the saloon and the dry goods store, and then from woman to woman through the church community, that Inez Grady was running the Sullivan property in a manner that was unseemly, that an unmarried woman alone on a man's land with hired help was a situation that reflected poorly on the community's values. Inez heard this from Hattie, who reported it with a face like a thundercloud and language that was significantly more colorful than one might expect from a church-going woman. Inez sat with it for a day and then did something that surprised even herself. She went to see Denton Hale. She rode Duchess to his ranch, which was a statement in itself since Duchess was by now a fine riding horse, and Inez sat her with confidence, and she tied the mare at his gate and knocked on his door and waited. Hale answered himself, which told her he had been watching her ride in. "Miss Grady," he said, and his surprise was not entirely hidden. "Mr. Hale," she said, "I want to make something clear to you. Perry Sullivan's land is not for sale, and it will not be lost to the bank, and I will manage it as it needs to be managed until he comes home, with whatever help I can afford to pay for. If you have a problem with that arrangement, the problem is yours to carry. I came to tell you this in person because I thought that was the more honest approach." She held his pale gaze for the full length of that speech and a moment beyond, and then she said, "Good day," and turned and walked back to Duchess and rode home. Whatever Hale had thought of her before that, she had the sense that she had settled something by going to him directly. The rumors quieted after that, not because the sentiment had changed, but because Inez Grady had made herself too clearly formidable to be comfortable gossip. The summer of 1863 was hard across the whole county. The drought that had spared them in the previous years arrived in June with a dry mouth and stayed. The creek dropped to half its usual flow. Inez managed the water carefully, rationing the cattle's access to the creek, and drawing from the household well for the garden, hauling bucket after bucket in the evenings when the heat had eased enough to make it bearable. She lost 3 rows of cotton to the dry spell, but saved the other 9 with careful irrigation. August Voss's agreement for grain crops she could not fully honor, but she sent him a letter explaining the circumstances, and he wrote back saying he understood and would carry the remainder of the contract to the following year. That was the kind of man August Voss was, which Inez filed away as information worth having. She also expanded the cattle operation that summer, which seemed counterintuitive in a drought year, but was actually logical because Denton Hale was selling off stock cheap rather than feed and water them through the dry months, and Inez bought 2 young heifers and a second bull from him at prices that would not have been available in any other circumstances. She paid Hale in coin with a face that showed nothing, and he took the money with the expression of a man who is not accustomed to being outwitted by someone who is 25 years old and female. By August of 1863, Inez Grady had 11 head of cattle, a healthy cotton crop that would clear the bank note again with room to spare, a kitchen garden that was the best producing operation within 5 miles of Lockhart, and a working arrangement with half the county built on fair dealing and reliable delivery. Perry Sullivan's 30 acres were not just surviving. They were thriving in the quiet, stubborn way that things thrive when someone loves them enough to refuse to let them fail. She wrote Perry about all of it. She did not know where the letters went or whether any of them arrived. She wrote them anyway. The second winter was easier in its practicalities and harder in its waiting. The war was showing no signs of ending. The news that filtered back to Lockhart was of terrible losses, of ground taken and retaken, of men coming home broken in ways that were not always visible. 2 men from the county had died at Gettysburg, and their names were added to the growing list that the church kept on a board near the door. Inez did not look at that board directly. She looked at it sideways, the way you can sometimes see things in low light better from the corner of your eye. She was sitting on the porch in December, mending a harness in the thin winter sun, when she heard the sound of a horse on the road. She looked up expecting Hattie or Tamaz or Ezra, but it was a man she did not know, riding a scrubby roan and wearing the kind of clothing that had seen considerable hard use. He stopped at the gate and asked if this was the Sullivan place, and she said it was, and he reached into his coat and produced a letter that was folded and refolded until it was soft as cloth at the creases. "Fella in my unit asked me to carry that, on account of he said the regular mail wasn't reaching," the man said. "Name of Sullivan, Perry Sullivan." Said there was a woman named Inez. She stood up so quickly that the harness fell from her lap. She crossed the yard and took the letter from the man's hand and felt the paper between her fingers. "Is he alive?" she said. "Is he well?" "He was when I left Virginia in October," the man said. "Healthy enough. He's a good soldier." He paused and then said with a kind of rough respect, "He talked about this place considerable." "Thank you," she said. "Please come inside. I can give you coffee and a meal if you're hungry." The man came inside, and she made coffee and bread, and he ate without talking much, which was fine with her because she was reading the letter. Perry's handwriting was unchanged, which felt like something solid to hold onto. He wrote in that careful way of his, the words measured and chosen. He said the fighting had been terrible, and that he was not going to describe it in detail because she did not need those pictures. He said that Virginia was green and strange and full of soldiers on both sides who were mostly just exhausted young men who wanted to go home. He said he thought about the land constantly, and then he said he thought about her constantly, and that the two things had become the same thought. He wrote, "I have been reading your letters over and over, the ones that reached me, which is not all of them but enough to understand what you have done. Inez, I cannot explain to you what it means to a man to know that the thing he loves is being cared for. I cannot find the right words for it. But I want to try to find them when I see you, which I intend to do, God willing, when this thing is over. I am coming home to you. Whatever I find when I get there, I am coming home to you." She held the letter flat on the kitchen table after the soldier had gone, with both hands pressed against it, as if she could feel the words through the paper. The evening light was long and gold through the window. She sat there for a long time. She wrote back to him that night, a long letter that told him everything she had not yet told him, everything practical and everything that was not practical at all, and she gave it to Hattie to send by the most reliable route she knew, which was through a cousin in San Antonio who had connections to supply routes running east. The spring of 1864 came, and with it, a new development that Inez had not anticipated. A young man named Fletcher Dodd showed up in Lockhart. He was 23, the son of a rancher from Bixar County, and he had come to Caldwell County to manage a property for a relative who had gone east. He was pleasant-faced and capable-looking, and within 2 weeks of his arrival, he had shown up at Inez's gate with his hat in his hands, and a reason about needing advice about the local soil conditions that was so transparently a pretext that even Ezra Cobb, who noticed these things without commenting on them, allowed himself a small smile. Inez was polite. She answered his questions about the soil, which were real enough questions even if the reason behind them was something else. She offered coffee, which was proper hospitality. She did not encourage him, and when he came back a second time with another set of questions, she answered those too and then said at the end, "Mr. Dodd, I appreciate you stopping by, but I want you to know that I am keeping this land for a man named Perry Sullivan who is serving in the Confederate Army, and I intend to give it to him exactly as he left it when he comes home. My attention is committed in that direction." Fletcher Dodd was a decent young man. He took this information with a nod and a flush of color across his cheekbones, said he understood entirely, and never came back with extraneous questions again. He did nod to her in town with perfect cordiality when they passed, and she nodded back, which was the proper end of the matter. That summer, the cattle operation grew again. Inez worked with Ezra to expand the herd by 2 more animals, trading carefully and always watching the water rights, always keeping the north fence strong and the hail border clear. The cotton came in well in the eastern fields for the 3rd year. The contract with August Voss was fulfilled in full. The grain crops she had shorted the year before made up with interest, and August Voss said with characteristic understatement that she was the best business partner he had worked with in 20 years in Texas, a statement that Inez accepted with a straight face and privately treasured. In October of 1864, she paid the bank note for the 3rd time. The bank officer, Edgar Pratt, had stopped looking surprised. He now looked something closer to admiring, though he was too dignified to say so. She had 14 head of cattle. She had a reliable seasonal contract with August Voss for grain crops. She had the cotton operation running at a dependable profit. She had a healthy kitchen garden that kept her and paid Hattie for the mercantile sales. She had Ezra Cobb, who had turned out to be one of the best decisions she had ever made, and she had the Wilson arrangement with Tamaz, who was now 17 and doing work of a quality that would serve him well wherever he went. She had a working farm on 30 acres of Texas soil that was in better condition than it had been when Perry Sullivan left it. She also had a fence along the north boundary that was the best fence in Caldwell County, and a reputation that meant Denton Hale had not come to her gate in over a year. The war dragged on into 1865. The news was different now. There was something collapsing in it, some structural shift in the momentum, and the men who came through Lockhart from the east or north brought stories that pointed in one direction. The Confederacy was contracting. The armies were shrinking. The thing was ending, not the way anyone had imagined it ending, but ending. Inez heard this and felt two things simultaneously. She felt relief that the dying might stop, and she felt a terror she had not allowed herself before, because the end of the war meant Perry Sullivan was coming home, and she had been waiting for that for 3 years. And now that it was becoming real, she was suddenly aware that she had made enormous promises in those letters, had said enormous things, and he had said enormous things back. And in 3 years of distance, it was possible to say things into the dark that might not survive contact with the actual light of day. She shook this thought off as being both useless and unworthy of the woman she had spent 3 years becoming, and she went back to work. April of 1865. Lee surrendered at Appomattox. The news came to Lockhart 10 days after the event, carried by a rider from Austin who stopped at the saloon and delivered it to the assembled population with an expression that reflected the complicated feelings of a community that had sent its men to fight for a cause that had just officially failed. There was grief in it, and relief, and the particular exhaustion of people who have been holding their breath for 4 years. Inez heard it standing in the dry goods store, where she had come for salt and lamp oil. She stood very still while the rider spoke, and then she set her purchases on the counter and said to the store owner, "I'll be back for those in a moment." And she went outside and stood in the street in the April sunlight and cried, which she had not done in a very long time. She cried for the men who were not coming home. She cried for the women who had held everything together and would now have to learn how to hold a different thing. She cried for the terrible waste of it all, 4 years of death and burning and broken things. And she cried because Perry Sullivan was somewhere in Virginia or Tennessee or wherever the road home began, and he was alive, and he was going to come back. She wiped her face, went back inside, paid for her salt and lamp oil, and went home. She did not know when to expect him. The demobilization of the Confederate armies was not an organized or rapid process. Men who had been fighting in Virginia or Georgia or Tennessee faced weeks or months of travel home, many of them on foot with nothing but what they carried. She knew he was coming. She did not know when. She put the property in its best order. She had Ezra and Tamaz mend every fence, paint the barn door, repair the porch step that had been complaining since the previous winter. She planted the kitchen garden with more care than she usually gave to aesthetics and less care than usual about practicality. She cleaned the house from the loft to the cellar. She kept Perry's room the way it had been, which was plain and clean and smelling of cedar. She also, for the first time in 3 years, spent a Sunday afternoon making herself something that was not work clothing. Hattie Beaumont, whose husband Clarence had come home the previous October, thin and quiet and different in ways that both of them were learning to navigate, came over with fabric and helped. The dress was simple blue calico, practical enough for daily wear but cut better than her usual, and Hattie sat across the kitchen table pinning the hem with pins between her teeth and looked at Inez over the fabric and said, "You know you are going to have to actually say all those things you have been writing in those letters." "I know," Inez said. "In person," Hattie said, "out loud with your voice." "I know," Inez said again. "Do you want to practice?" Hattie offered. "Absolutely not," Inez said. Hattie grinned and went back to the pins. June came, then July. The summer heat settled over the land like a weight. Inez worked the fields and tended the cattle and waited with the particular patience of a woman who has learned that patience is not the absence of feeling but the management of it. She was 27 years old. She felt, in some ways, much older. In others, she felt exactly the age she was. It was a Thursday morning in early August when Duchess lifted her head from the paddock fence and looked south along the road with her ears sharp forward. Inez was in the kitchen garden on her knees in the dirt with a trowel in her hand, and she looked up at the horse's response before she looked at the road, because Duchess was a more reliable indicator of approaching company than any other instrument she owned. She stood up. She shaded her eyes against the morning sun. There was a figure on the road, walking, coming from the south, which was the Lockhart direction. A man, carrying a pack that was slung over one shoulder, wearing clothing that had been made for a soldier, and had served that purpose for some time, and then been worn for however many miles it took to walk from Virginia to Texas, which was an answer she would not get for a while. She did not run. She thought about running. She decided that running was not the right entry point to this conversation, that the things she had to say deserved to be said by a woman who was standing on both feet and breathing steadily. So she walked to the gate, and she opened it, and she stood inside it and watched him come. Perry Sullivan walked up the road toward his own land with the particular way of moving that a man develops when he has been on foot for a very long time. It was deliberate and unhurried, each step placed with care. He was thinner than he had been. His face was different, sharpened by experience in ways she could see from 50 yards away. But his eyes, when he got close enough to see them, were the same. Those steady brown eyes that had always looked at things, at her, as if they were worth understanding. He stopped at the gate. He looked at her for a long moment. He looked past her at the land, at the barn and the house and the fields, and then back at her. He said nothing for a moment, and she let the silence stand because some silences are doing necessary work. "The fence looks good," he said finally, and his voice was exactly the same. She felt something unlock in her chest that she had not known was locked. "Thomas Wilson rebuilt it," she said, "twice." He nodded slowly, looking at the north fence line. Then he looked at the cattle in the near pasture, counting them without making a production of it. "There are more of them," he said. 14, she said. "I bought 2 heifers and a bull from Hale at drought prices in '63. He was selling cheap to save on water." Perry Sullivan stared at her for a long moment, and then he did something she had not expected from a man who was generally very economical with his expressions. He smiled. Not a small smile. A large, unguarded smile that changed his entire face, and she felt the impact of it like warmth. "Of course you did," he said. "The banknote is current," she said. "Has been every October. Cotton and grain covered it the first 2 years, and the cattle operation is carrying its own weight now. I have a grain contract with August Voss that runs through spring." He had walked through the gate by now and was standing close enough that she could see the detail of his face clearly, the new lines around his eyes, the way his jaw was set differently from how it had been. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized from the letters, the thing behind the careful words. "You kept it," he said. "You asked me to," she said. "I know I did," he said. But Inez, and then he stopped, and she could see him assembling words the way he always did, finding the right ones, and she thought about 3 years of letters and the things she had written in them and the things she had promised to say to his face, and she decided that she was not going to wait for him to assemble all the words. "I said I would tell you when you came home," she said. "I meant what I wrote. I love you, Perry. I have loved you since before you left, and I love you more now, if that is possible, which it apparently is." He was very still. And then he reached out and took her hand, her right hand with the trowel in it, and he wrapped both his hands around hers and held it the way you hold something you thought you might have lost. "I meant what I wrote too," he said, "every word of it." "I know," she said. "I kept the letters." "So did I," he said, "all of them, even the ones that came late." He paused. "Especially the last one." She knew which last one he meant. The one she had written after the soldier brought his letter in December of 1863. The letter she had given to Hattie's cousin in San Antonio. The letter where she had said everything, plainly and completely, without the careful obliqueness of the earlier ones. She had spent some time since then wondering if she had been too plain. She stopped wondering about that now. They stood there at the gate of his land in the August morning with her hand in his, and the cattle moved slowly in the near pasture, and somewhere in the barn Duchess was making the low rumbling sound she made when she was content, and it was, Inez thought, the most complete moment she had ever lived in. "Come inside," she said. "I have coffee, and there is a great deal more I need to tell you about the property, and you look like you have not eaten a proper meal in several months." "Several months is conservative," he said. She made breakfast. A real breakfast. Eggs from the chickens she had added to the operation the previous year, cornbread, coffee, that was actual coffee from the supplies she had been restocking since the blockade ended. Perry sat at the kitchen table where she had last seen him sitting the night before he left, and he ate without hurrying, and she sat across from him and told him everything. About Hale and the offers and the confrontation at his ranch. About August Voss and Hattie and Clara Wilson and Tomas. About Ezra Cobb, who would be arriving shortly and whose work on the cattle operation she could not speak highly enough of. About the drought year and the fence rebuilding and the cotton prices and the bank notes. Perry listened to all of it with his hands wrapped around his coffee cup and his eyes on her, and she could see that he was doing two things at once. He was hearing the practical information and storing it in the efficient way his mind worked, and he was watching her, watching the woman who had managed his 30 acres for 3 years and turned them into something better than he had left them. And she could see in his face a quality of feeling that was beyond what she knew how to name, but that she knew she would spend the rest of her life learning the shape of. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Ezra Cobb, he's being paid fair. Same as any white hand from the start," she said. Perry nodded. "Good. And I'd like to keep him on," she said. "The cattle operation is at the scale now where we need the hand, and he is worth twice what we pay him." "Whatever you think is right," Perry said. "You know this operation better than I do now." "You'll learn it again fast," she said. "It is your land." He looked at her. "It is our land," he said simply, as though this were a fact that did not require discussion. She felt the warmth of it go all the way through her. He spent the first week home in the way that a man spends a week when he has been away at war for 4 years, and is relearning how to be a person who is not at war. He was quiet in the mornings. He walked the land every evening, the whole perimeter of the 30 acres, sometimes alone and sometimes with her, and she could see him reading it the way you reread a book you loved, finding everything familiar and some things changed, and the changes not wrong but simply new. He met Ezra with the directness he gave everyone, a handshake and a request for Ezra's assessment of the cattle operation that was so sincere and thorough that Ezra's reserve, which was considerable, softened noticeably. He met August Voss and liked him immediately, 2 men with a shared philosophy about fair dealing and careful work. He had a long conversation with Clara Wilson that Inez was not privy to, but which resulted in Clara sending him a pot of tamales the following day, which was the highest possible expression of Clara Wilson's regard. He met Tomas, who was now a young man of 17 with adult work in his past, and Perry looked him over and then looked at Inez and raised an eyebrow in an expression that said clearly, "This is the boy who rebuilt my fence." And she nodded, and Perry shook Tomas's hand with a respect that Tomas accepted with dignity. And then one evening, 10 days after he came home, they were sitting on the porch in the last light of a summer evening, and Perry turned to her and said, "I want to ask you something properly." She looked at him. He had the composed expression of a man who has been thinking about a thing for a long time and has decided that the time has arrived. "I know what I am asking you is asking you to stay in a life that has already been hard," he said. "You have been working this land for 3 years and it has not been easy, and there is no reason to expect that changes. But I would like very much for you to be my wife, Inez, if that is something you want." She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said, "obviously yes. I have been waiting for you to say that since some time in 1860. Something came loose in his face when she said it. He reached over and took her hand again, and this time he did not let go of it. 1860, he said. That is a long time to wait. It was worth it, she said. They were married in September of 1865 at the church in Lockhart, and the ceremony was attended by approximately every person in Caldwell County who had any acquaintance with either of them, which was most of the county. Hattie Beaumont cried in the elaborate way that she cried for events she had decided deserved it, which was lavishly and without apology. Clarence Beaumont, who was slowly finding his way back to the man he had been before the war, shook Perry's hand with feeling. Clara Wilson attended in a black dress that had been her finest since 1855 and brought tamales for the celebration after. Tamaz stood very straight and looked proud in a way that reminded Inez that she had become, in the course of 3 years, something like a significant figure to him. August Voss came and brought his wife, a small, severe woman named Liselot, who unbent enough to tell Inez that the grain she had delivered was of exceptional quality, which from Liselot Voss was a declaration of love. Denton Hale did not attend. This was not surprising and was not a loss. Ezra Cobb came to the celebration after the ceremony and drank a cup of cider with them and said, with the precision that characterized everything he said, "I'd like to stay on, if you'll have me." They told him they would, and they meant it, and the three of them shook hands on it with a seriousness that was appropriate to the occasion. The fall of 1865 was a new kind of season. Perry was back in the work of the land, learning what had changed and contributing the knowledge he had carried away with him that had not diminished in 4 years. He and Inez worked beside each other from sunup to midday most days, and the ease of it was not the ease of strangers finding their footing, but the ease of people who already knew each other's rhythms, and were discovering, with some delight, that those rhythms fit together well. They talked in the evenings the way people talk when there is a great deal that has been saved up. Perry told her about the war, not the parts she did not need, but enough that she understood what he had carried and what he was still carrying, and she told him about the 3 years in the same way, with enough detail to account for what she had become in his absence. They were different people from the two who had stood on the porch the morning he left. They were better people, she thought. Not better because the hardship had been good, but better because they had both spent 4 years doing the work of people who had to be capable of more than they knew. The cotton crop of 1865 was the best in the history of the Sullivan land. 30 rows of thick white bolls that came in on a clear October day that smelled of autumn and possibility. Inez and Perry picked it together, with Ezra and a hired pair of hands from town, working the rows from east to west while the afternoon went golden around them. At the end of the last row, Perry stopped and looked back at what they had picked, and then at the land, and then at Inez standing in the October light with her hands stained and her hair coming loose from its braid, and he said something she had not expected. "Do you know what this looks like?" he said. "What?" she said. "It looks like everything I was trying to come home to," he said. She looked at him. "Perry Sullivan," she said, "that might be the most romantic thing you have ever said." "I am working on it," he said. She laughed. It was a good laugh, full and unguarded, the laugh of someone who is very happy, and it went out across the field and the land received it the way the land receives everything, quietly and completely. They paid the bank note in October as they had always done, but this time they paid it together, sitting side by side at Edgar Pratt's desk, and Inez had the private pleasure of watching Pratt look at Perry, and then at her, and then at the coins she slid across and understand, in the expression that crossed his face, that whatever he might have thought about the arrangements on the Sullivan property over the previous 3 years, the results were rather difficult to argue with. In the winter of 1865, they began to talk about the future in a way that was different from planning, that was closer to imagining. Perry wanted to expand the cattle operation further. Inez wanted to develop the creekside acreage that had never been fully cultivated. They debated this at the kitchen table over many evenings, with maps drawn on the back of old letters and arithmetic done in pencil and coffee going cold. And the debates were the good kind, the kind where both people are trying to reach the same destination, and the argument is only about the best road. They also, that winter, talked about children. Practically, as they talked about most things. Perry said he had thought about it every day in Virginia, the idea of having a family to come home to, and Inez said she had thought about it too, in those long evenings alone on the land, though she had never allowed herself to dwell on it because she needed all her thinking for the work that was directly in front of her. But now the work was different and the future was visible, and they were not dreaming alone. In the spring of 1866, Inez told Perry she was expecting a child. He was at the barn when she told him, doing something with a harness buckle, and he went very still in the way he went still when something mattered enormously, and then he set the harness down and looked at her with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life. It was not a complicated expression. It was simply a man looking at a woman with everything he had. "When?" he said. "November," she said. "Around the harvest." He crossed the barn and took her hands and held them between his in the way that had become, over the months of their marriage, one of the most familiar gestures of her daily life. "Are you well?" he said. "How do you feel?" "I feel exactly fine," she said. "I am going to keep working through the summer. You are not to fuss at me about it." "I am going to fuss at you about it," he said, quietly, at respectful intervals. "Fair enough," she said. The summer of 1866 was long and warm and full of the particular quality that good summers have when the rains come right and the work is productive, and there is something you are waiting for that you want to arrive. Inez worked through the growing season as she had promised, perhaps a little more carefully than before, but fully. She rode Duchess out to the east fields in the mornings when the air was still cool, and she managed the garden and directed the grain planting and consulted with Ezra about the cattle, and Perry worked beside her and fussed at respectful intervals exactly as he had promised. Hattie Beaumont, who had her own news in the form of a second pregnancy, was delighted in a thorough and vocal way. Clara Wilson came by and brought herbs and practical advice in equal measure. August Voss and Lieselot sent a gift of a carved wooden cradle that Lieselot's brother had made back in Germany before they emigrated. A serious and beautiful thing that looked like it was built to last 100 years. The cotton came in October, and it was another good crop, and Inez supervised the harvest from horseback through the first week and on foot through the second, and Perry watched her with a hawk level of attention, and said nothing about it because he had learned that saying something was only worth it when she was actually not fine, and she was fine. Thomas Perry Sullivan was born on the 12th of November, 1866, on a cold, clear night with the stars very bright over the Texas flat. He arrived into the world with considerable complaint, which the midwife called a healthy sign, and Inez held him and looked at Perry over the top of their son's head, and felt the completeness of the moment settle around her like something permanent. Perry held the baby with the care of a man who is encountering something that matters more than anything he has encountered, which included 4 years of war, and his expression was the fullest she had ever seen it. "Thomas," he said, "after your father." Her father's name had been Thomas Grady. He had died when she was 19. "Yes," she said, "if you do not mind." "I do not mind," Perry said. "I think it is exactly right." Little Thomas Perry Sullivan was born into a household that had worked hard for everything it had, and the land he arrived on was stronger than it had ever been. The Sullivan spread, those 30 acres east of Lockhart, was known through the county now as one of the best managed properties in the region, a status that Inez accepted with her customary plainness, and Perry with a pride that was perhaps a little less plainly worn. Ezra Cobb stayed on through that year and the next, and settled into the role of the operation's most indispensable member. The year after the war ended, with emancipation formalized across the South, Ezra's status changed in the eyes of the law, though his station on the Sullivan property had never been anything other than what Inez had set it as: a valued worker paid fairly for skilled work. Perry, who had come home from a war that had been fought over questions that included the humanity of men like Ezra, had strong feelings about ensuring that the formal end of the institution was reflected in practice on his land, as a matter of principle. He and Ezra had a conversation about this that Inez was not present for, but she saw the result of it in the handshake they exchanged afterward, and in the way Ezra Cobb walked across the Sullivan yard after that, which was the walk of a man who is fully certain of his ground. Denton Hale's operation to the south had declined considerably since the end of the war. The drought years had cost him more than he had recovered, and without the labor system he had depended on, the economics of his large spread had become difficult to manage. He sold off the southern quarter of his ranch in 1867, and Inez and Perry bought 10 acres of it at fair price, not the creek water acres, which Hale would have tried to profit from, but the eastern pasture land that bordered their property, and that had always been well grassed. With those 10 acres added, the Sullivan spread became 40 acres of productive Texas land, a significant operation that employed several people and contributed meaningfully to the county's commerce. They expanded the house the following year. Perry designed the addition himself: 2 new rooms on the east side of the original structure, and a proper porch that wrapped around 3 sides, and he and Ezra and Tamaz Wilson, who was now a young man of 20 and had become something like a steady presence in their lives, built it through the late summer and fall of 1867. Inez supervised the kitchen expansion with the same attention she gave to the fields, which meant it ended up larger and better appointed than Perry had originally planned, and he conceded this improvement without significant resistance. Tamaz Wilson, it should be noted, had by this time developed a friendship with the Voss family's youngest daughter, a girl named Marta who was 20, and had her mother Lieselot's direct manner and her father August's warmth. Inez watched this develop over the course of several visits to the Voss farm for grain contract discussions, watched the way Tamaz helped Marta carry things he had not been asked to help carry, and the way she looked at him when he wasn't watching, and she said nothing to either of them but mentioned it to Perry on the ride home, and Perry said, "Good," which was his full assessment of the situation. By 1868, the Sullivan property was what Inez had spent 6 years building it to be: stable, productive, and alive in the way that places are alive when they are genuinely tended. Little Thomas, nearly 2, had begun walking and did so with a determination that both his parents recognized as inheritable rather than coincidental. He went everywhere in the yard with his arms out for balance and his brow furrowed with focus, and Duchess watched him through the paddock fence with the patient interest of an old horse who has seen many things and found this particular thing acceptable. The great project of the spring of 1868 was the creek restoration. Inez had been wanting to address the North Creek banks since she had first mapped the property's water situation years before. The drought had damaged the vegetation along the creek's edge, and without good root systems to hold the banks, the creek was losing a little of its channel every year. She proposed to Perry a restoration of the native grasses and trees along the bank that would stabilize the creek for the long term. It was not a money-making project. It was the kind of investment that paid off over decades, and Perry listened to her describe it and said yes without any further discussion, because he had learned over 2 years of marriage and 6 years of admiration that Inez Grady Sullivan's long-term judgment about this land was one of the most reliable things in his life. They planted native grasses and cottonwood seedlings along the creek banks that spring, working beside each other on their knees in the mud, while Thomas toddled along the bank above them under Ezra's loose supervision, testing everything with his hands with the experimental confidence of a boy who has not yet learned what he should be afraid of. In the evenings that spring, with Thomas asleep and the land quiet around them and the creak audible through the open window of the new East Room. Inez and Perry sat on the expanded porch and talked the way they had been talking since he came home, easily and fully about the land and the work and the people who populated their life, about the past and what it had cost and what it had built. Sometimes they sat without talking at all, which was its own kind of conversation. "Do you think about the war?" she asked him one of those evenings. He was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes," he said, "less than I did. It is getting quieter." "Good," she said. "Do you think about the first year?" he asked. "Alone out here," she considered it. "I think about it as a thing that happened," she said. "I am glad it is not now." He reached over and took her hand. His hand was warm and familiar, scarred at the knuckles as it had always been, and she held it the way she had held things through those years, completely and with the intention of not letting go. "I should have said things before I left," he said. It was something he had said before, not often, but with a consistency that told her it was something he turned over. "You said what you needed to say," she said. "The letter in the tin." "The last line," he said. She smiled. "The last line," she agreed. "It was a good last line." The note in the coffee tin had said many practical things, and then at the very end, "You are the best person I know." She had read that line in the cold kitchen the morning after he left and felt it land somewhere permanent. It had been the clearest thing he had said to her in 3 years of not saying things clearly, and it had carried her through considerable darkness. "Next time," she said, "just lead with it." "Next time I am not leaving," he said, "so there is no lead." She laughed, and the laugh went out across the spring dark, and the land received it. By 1869, the Sullivan spread was fully what it was always going to be under the right hands. The cattle numbered 22, a genuine herd now, well managed and profitable. The cotton operation was running 35 rows in good years, and Inez had introduced a rotation system that kept the soil healthier than the single crop approach most of their neighbors used. The grain operation for Voss was consistent and reliable. The creek banks were holding with the restored vegetation, the cottonwoods 3 years old now, and showing the solid young growth that said they would stand for a generation. Inez was pregnant again that spring. Thomas was 2.5 and had developed a strong personality that expressed itself loudly and frequently, and Perry watched his son with an expression that was equal parts wonder and the specific alertness of a parent who knows that the next thing this child does could be anything at all. They were expecting the second child in the fall, and both of them moved through the work of the season with the particular quality of people who are busy and glad about it. Clara Wilson had become one of the most important people in their life. She came for supper most Sundays, and she and Inez talked about the land and the cattle with a seriousness that Perry had long since stopped thinking was remarkable and started thinking of as simply correct, because it was. Clara's experience and Inez's had shaped each other over the years into something that was greater than either one alone. Clara was 60 now, and had the presence of someone who has distilled a lifetime's understanding into complete stillness, and she looked at the Sullivan property and the Sullivan marriage with an approval that she expressed sparingly and therefore significantly. Tomas Wilson and Marta Voss were married in the summer of 1869, a ceremony in the Lockhart Church that was smaller than Inez and Perry's but no less sincere, and Inez stood with Hattie Beaumont in a pew and watched the young man who had rebuilt her fence twice and the young woman who had her father's warmth take their vows, and she felt the continuity of it. The way that one act of asking for help 4 years ago had extended into this moment through a chain of practical kindnesses and work and human connection. Their second child, Margaret Rose Sullivan, arrived in October of 1869 during the cotton harvest, as though she had decided the timing was symbolic or perhaps was simply determined to make her entrance when the household was at maximum activity. She was healthy and dark-haired and looked at the world from her first hours with an expression of focused assessment that Inez recognized immediately. "She has your face," Perry said, looking at his daughter. "She has your eyes," Inez said. "That expression, though," Perry said, That is entirely you." Thomas, for his part, examined his new sister with the thorough suspicion of a child confronting something that has altered the established order, and then accepted her with the practicality of a boy who is fundamentally like both his parents. The house was full. The land was full. The days were long and useful, and the evenings were the best of it. The lamplight across the kitchen table, the sound of children sleeping, the creak audible through the window if the night was quiet enough. The man who had come home sitting across from her with his coffee and his steady eyes, and the fullness of everything they had built. Denton Hale sold the last of his cattle operation in 1870 and moved away from Caldwell County, which simplified matters considerably. The land to the south of the Sullivan property was bought by a young couple named Reeves who came from Georgia and knew farming, and were good neighbors in the way that people are good neighbors when they intend to stay. Ezra Cobb built himself a small house on the edge of the Sullivan property in 1870, which Inez and Perry offered him the land for at a price that was the same as a handshake, and he lived in it with the dignity of a man who has secured the ground beneath his feet after a lifetime of being uncertain of it. He was part of the Sullivan operation in every way that mattered, and the children called him Mr. Ezra, and he allowed this with the serious demeanor of someone who takes the trust of children as a genuine responsibility. In the spring of 1871, Inez and Perry walked the full perimeter of the property together the way they did every spring, checking fence and water and the state of the soil after winter, and they walked it the way they walked everything now, side by side, talking and sometimes not. The cottonwoods along the creek were 5 years old and substantial. The north fence was strong and permanent. The cattle grazed in the east pasture, and the west field was ready for planting. The house behind them, with its expanded rooms and its good porch, sat solid in the morning light. 40 acres, Perry said, looking out from the north fence line to the south boundary. Plus the creek, Inez said. Plus the creek, he agreed. He looked at her. You saved it. We built it, she said. You saved it first, he said. 3 years alone, that was. He stopped. He had a way of stopping when the magnitude of something exceeded his economy with words. She had learned to wait in those stops. I do not have the words for what that was, he said. You do not need words for it, she said. It is right here. He turned to look at the land, at the whole sweep of it in the April light, 30 years of his family's history and 4 years of her determination and 5 years of their life together, the fence and the creek and the cattle and the crops and the house with the children asleep in it still at this early hour. Right here, he said. She took his hand. He closed his fingers around hers. They stood there in the April morning on their 40 acres east of Lockhart, Texas, and the land was solid under them, and the creek ran clear along the north boundary, and the cottonwoods Perry's father had never planted but that had grown from Inez's planting were catching the first real green of the season, and there was coffee on the stove inside, and the children would be awake soon, and the day would begin with the 10,000 small necessities that made up a life. It was. They both understood everything. The summer came in green and warm. Thomas was 5 now and had taken up the habit of following Ezra through the cattle pasture in the mornings, asking questions at the rate of approximately 1 every 40 seconds, and Ezra answered every single one of them with the patience of a man who has decided that a child's questions are worth answering. Margaret was nearly 2 and had Inez's stubbornness and Perry's precise attention to detail, a combination that expressed itself as a toddler who wanted to understand the mechanism of every object she encountered and would not be redirected by anything short of a natural disaster. They were at the table one evening in July, the children in bed and the house quiet and the lamp burning between them, when Perry pulled the old letter from his pocket, the letter from the coffee tin, so worn at the folds now that it was held together more by memory than by paper. He put it on the table between them. She looked at it. She reached out and touched the edge of it. I have been carrying this since 1862, he said. I know, she said. I saw you put it in your coat. He looked at her. You saw that? I saw most things, she said. I just did not say all of them. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I want to write something on the back of it, if you will let me. She said nothing, just turned the letter over and slid it toward him and handed him the pencil from beside the account ledger. He wrote for a moment slowly, with the same careful hand that had written her that last letter from Virginia. Then he turned it and pushed it back to her. She read it in the lamplight. It said, "The best person I know is also the love of my life, which I should have said in 1860. P.S." She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked up at him. "You are getting better at the romantic things," she said. "I have had a good teacher," he said. She folded the letter back along its worn lines and held it in both hands for a moment, feeling the weight of it, all the years of it, the morning he left and the 3 years alone and the letter the soldier carried and the day he walked back up the road and every season since. "Keep it somewhere better than your pocket," she said. "That paper is not going to last another 9 years. "I will put it in the cedar box," he said. "With yours." Her cedar box. She had kept her copies of every letter she had written him in it, a 3-year archive of the woman she had been while he was gone. It was under the bed still, in the room that was no longer hers alone but theirs, and it was one of the things she would not trade for anything. "The cedar box," she agreed. He got up from the table and she heard him go to the bedroom, and she heard the soft sound of the box being opened and then closed, and then he came back and sat down across from her, and his hands were empty and his face was the face she had been looking at for 9 years now across tables and fields and fence lines, and the 1,000 ordinary beautiful moments that make up a life that is genuinely lived. The lamp burned between them. Outside, the creek moved along the north boundary, steady and clear. The cottonwoods stood in the dark. The cattle were quiet in the east pasture. The 40 acres of the Sullivan spread lay still and breathing under the Texas stars, cared for and strong and permanent. "Tomorrow I need to look at the east field drainage," she said. "After the last rain the low corner is holding water longer than it should." "I saw that," he said. "I was thinking we could redirect the south end of the irrigation cut." "That is what I was thinking too," she said. "Good," he said. They sat a while longer in the good light, talking about the land.